Hello. So for this video I'm going to be talking about flashcards and their use in language learning, and I'll be using this box, flashcards that I made, and this book here, A Course in Japanese, as my examples. So flashcards can be very useful in learning a language. They have they can really help you memorize the vocabulary that you're having trouble with, which is the best way to use them, in my opinion, is actually to focus on the vocabulary that you're having trouble with from the books that you're using, that you're actively using. And, in this way, you're going to be using words that you'll be coming into contact with for sure, and not just vocabulary that's, from a pre-made set, but you might not really often come up, even if it's a common word, it might not occur in the book you're using or any of the books you're using. So it's not bad to come up with it or to learn it, but you want to be seeing vocabulary that you're actually going to actively be using and hearing and seeing, frequently, right? And so there's basically, you could say from that, there are three types of flashcards roughly. The handmade ones you see here, pre-made ones, and online ones, stuff like Memrise. I think Anki's like that. Duolingo, to a lesser extent, is like that. And they each have their own little advantages, right? In the case of, pre-made cards, if you get something like the 3,000 most common vocabulary, the nice thing is that you don't have to do the vocabulary by hand. It's already made. And that's very handy early on, right? The only downside is because it's going to be, the most common vocabulary typically, the downside is that you'll probably be coming across most of that pretty quickly. So it can be helpful, but it means the cards will probably become useless pretty quickly too. And that's sort of the downside about flashcards in general, but it's vocabulary that's going to be a little bit more commonly seen. So, just reading it, you'll pick it up, probably, just pretty quickly, right? In the case of online cards, they have that too. But, like Memrise, for example, if you're not aware, Memrise is, they offer their own courses, but then people can make their own individual courses based on, say, you could take this book and you could take all the vocabulary from here, and basically it's kind of similar to Duolingo at times. I think you can do sentences, like whole sentences, but a lot of the stuff is just word for word vocabulary, so... but you could do that, you could make your own, and that can be very helpful, particularly if somebody's already put that up, if you don't know how to do that or you don't have the time or whatever, and somebody's already put that up, you can download it to your phone, you can do it online on your computer, so it's very handy in that sense, especially if you're using the same types of courses. But let's say instead of this book, you're using this book here, this book is a set of 3, and this book is a set of 2. The set of 2 offers 3,500 vocabulary. The one here that's a set of 3 offers something like 4,000. So, learning the vocabulary in here won't necessarily be entirely helpful for what's in here, right? So that's kind of the downside to some of the Memrise and stuff, is that, it's never bad learning vocabulary. It's just you want to see it used, because just seeing the word isn't really going to, keep it in your mind in the same way just from a flashcard, right? And so that's kind of one of the downsides about some of the online learning, and even with Duolingo, I see that for Japanese, that I'm able to test out of most of the stuff. The vast majority of it doesn't really, it's not as helpful as I would, I haven't found it as helpful as I have, for example, Korean. It's, kind of figuring out how that, the writing system, or Chinese, they add the pronunciation, so that's always really important for a language like Chinese. But if you've already studied the language to a good extent, it seems like it's maybe not it's not bad, but it's just you're not really going to be learning as much. So you want to focus, obviously, on where you're going to be picking up vocabulary and where you're going to learn, which is why I really personally highly recommend, handwritten cards, because, the 3,000 most common vocabulary, unless you're able to select it and choose it yourself, is not necessarily going to be all that useful. You might end up picking up a huge amount of it. Well, let's say you go through a couple of books, there's always overlap, so you're going to get a lot of that, and it's just not going to be as useful to you in a pretty short order. compared to this, whereas, you know, these are all handwritten, and there's probably, you know, several hundred or several thousand, so I have written out a few thousand cards, which is way too much. I don't recommend doing that. You know, for example, here you have the vocabulary. Every lesson comes with a nice list, and I don't actually recommend doing every word in the vocabulary. Although in the case of Chinese or Japanese, you might be able to arguably do that because of the characters that are used. You know, there's a couple thousand characters that are used. In the case of Japanese, they have different readings, so that might be a little more helpful in that case. But, you know, in general, if there's vocabulary that's not, you know, that you're going to be coming across anyway, you know, there's no point in really writing it out. It's better to see first what gives you difficulty. And, you know, that's what I've started to do with these, for example, is, okay, well, what's giving me the most trouble? You know, okay, I'll write that word out, because otherwise you're having to sort a lot, you're having to figure out what you don't need, and if you take all that time to write it out, it won't be particularly helpful. You know, it's just kind of a waste of time, you know, which is something you don't want to do when learning a language. You want to make it very productive. So, yeah, I do highly recommend using flashcards for vocabulary that, you know, you read it and you have a hard time and just, you know, the word's not staying. Especially in the case, like, you can see here, you know, I've underlined a lot of these words, and, you know, it's handy for that reason, right? So, yeah, I would recommend using it for that.